Voices. Being heard is as vital to life as air, water, and food. We may recognize sound, but are we really listening? Are certain voices ignored? The series Four Voices offers the mic to young Black people who share their stories of identity, religion, and spirituality. Let's listen to Maxine.
And I identify more so kind of like as a Black, queer, trans woman. And then also kind of going further into that, like taking apart like my queerness, I used to identify more so specifically as kind of like a pansexual, but then how I understand like my sexual orientation is to kind of be almost in a kind of like a changing and rotating kind of role. And that always looks like something that doesn't necessarily fit any other sort of label. And so I kind of just retake that specific word and kind of use it for that, even though I may sort of like align in some specific, what would normally be specific labels. I kind of just use that one just to describe how fluid and changing it can be. And as a trans woman, I identify specifically kind of like in the gender spectrum, or like how I kind of like to think of it as kind of like the gender sphere is kind of like more so on the feminine side, but still in kind of like a little bit of like the gray area. And so I feel more comfortable claiming the term of like being a woman. And having access to womanhood. And that is something that has been a little bit newer for me, just like as a person and understanding myself. But it really is, I've noticed that it feels best. I used to identify more so kind of like non-binary specifically, but then how I started to understand what gender was for me was that it was more so always kind of devoted to this kind of specific feminine energy. And that's where the majority of me resides.
Who are we, really? How do we know? What if who we are contradicts society's norms? Maxine asked these questions even as a child.
I always kind of like start with like when I was younger. So I kind of sort of knew in some kind of very like unspoken way about everything when I was younger. And that's when I was like, I'm talking like 3, 4. But I just didn't have like the language to kind of like really talk about it. And I didn't really have the understanding that what I was feeling and what I was understanding was a concept. And so I always kind of attributed like being like manhood and kind of understanding that as being part of, you know, some of the societal kind of recognitions, and that and I always kind of understood that at some point you would just reach a milestone and you would kind of feel it and you would kind of understand what it was and you would kind of really take to it. And so from when I was like 3 or 4 on, like I would set milestones and kind of like try to really adhere to those milestones. And I think that what my parents were telling me was more so kind of like not just stuff that they wanted me to do, but really kind of like realizations and actualizations, I guess, of my own identity that would start to come through. And so it's that milestone after milestone, starting from like, I was 13, and then got to be 18, and then, you know, getting a job, and it's like all these different things. And then at some point, I just realized, well, it's just nothing's changed. So I'm still in the same place. I'm still kind of like feeling the same way.
Maxine's confidence grew over time. She realized that being different is not good or bad. It's just different.
You know, it was part of like your growth as a college student. You're supposed to basically do all your work, still have some sort of personal growth, you know, really do like activities, still be involved and like have a social life. But then what does that social life look like when there's no one else around that's like you? And even when I was in specifically like trans spaces, there was only so much that I could really get, in that I never really was able to connect with more people that were exactly like me. And not saying that they all have like the same experiences, but more so in that, you know, there's experiences that I have and that I fear for that they don't have, especially when they're white.
From self-definition comes self-love and transformation.
what I'm most proud of in my life is being able to, and the word I want to use is affect legislative change, but more so specifically, it would be helping change the city's non-discrimination statement in order to include gender expression. And also from the presentation that I've made to, the caucus, and then which the caucus has taken to the council, is that there's a new anti-bullying policy for Metro employees that was being pursued from that.
I come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. This Bible verse offers assurance to believers like Maxine. So, she remains part of the community of faith. But the search for truth continues.
So, I originally have just kept with our family's traditional faith in a lot of ways. But as I sort of grew into myself and my identity as like a trans person and a queer person, and also still really keeping in touch with, what's been traditional spirituality for my family as Black Southerners. And for us, that's been the Missionary Baptist Church, which is not always particularly friendly. But in that, I have always recognized the truth and the dedication that comes with the faith. And that even though I may disagree with how pastors and how preachers are talking about the faith, that there is so much truth and power in folks' passion, and just the dedication to the faith itself. It's been kind of used more so kind of like as a weapon against communities, and from that, I still recognize that there's so much truth to it, I do feel that there is just mistranslation somewhere, and that there's something just it hasn't been said in the right way. It's been kind of just been parts that have been just left out, parts that have been sort of like misconstrued, because from how I understand myself and how I have come to understand my relationship with the Lord is that I'm still very much in tune with who I am, and that I'm still the same person. But how folks would kind of understand outside from my perspective and from my experience just as a person is that I have just completely ultimately changed and I've gone against. And I think one of the things that has kept me even interested at all in the faith is, two things. It would be the music, and that whenever I listen to the music and I kind of think about the music and I feel like the truth of that, I can't help but feel some sort of attachment still. And even if it's not necessarily like you have to go to church every day, or you have to go to Bible study, you have to go to choir rehearsal, like do church every day of the week. It's more so in that there is still something connecting me to a greater whole, and that I'm still representative, even though people would probably disagree, but I'm even more representative of something that is a part of the divine, and not necessarily more separate from it. It's more so in that I have such a unique experience, and that I am still a part of something, and that there's so few people that are like me, and so I contribute just by my existence to the real, true, and depth of diversity that is a part of just like humanity. There are so few people that understand what I understand on this kind of deep personal level. And that's not necessarily anything kind of like I'm better than people, but it's more so kind of like, this is part of the truth that we don't see or that we don't want to see. And so I think, given that faith and spirituality have been tied to sort of like power for so long, once you try to divest the power from it and more so kind of take the hierarchy a little bit more, then you kind of get to see that the faith has existed in all these different forms. And so I understand myself as to be part of the faith in just different form, this different, much rarer form, and that power and my recognizing of it is kind of just imbued in my existence, and not necessarily in the pulpit and not necessarily with preachers. It's that by me recognizing who I am, then that gives it power to my faith.
Black church music sustains her. Harmony and melody foster a sense of connection.
And I think what the other thing besides like the music that really pulls me in and like really still keeps me into the faith is that I do still feel just the attachment of, that there is a larger world out there and that there is a larger divine presence. And I feel that as I and I still always question it a little bit in that is it more and more so still kind of like my own parents' teachings? Is it more so that, it's like I'm having a learned behavior, but when I'm in this really deep, really negative place and I am trying to get my own self out, I am still thinking and drawing on a power that is not necessarily always from me. It's more so also kind of with me. One of the things that really kind of stuck out to me about church, and that there's something kind of being misinterpreted, was a kind of the sort of subservience of women, and that women have to have this certain like subordinate place in the household, and that our home church pastor was really big about men need to take the lead. Men should be leading, like we need more men leading. And to me, that always seemed to be a disservice because there were so many women in the church that were the foundation of it. And then also kind of like the, homosexuality is a sin piece. That's one of the other things that always kind of rubbed me the wrong way and just kind of just intrinsically knew wasn't necessarily right. I never really considered that a correct interpretation. Even as I was starting to come out to myself, even back in high school, it wasn't necessarily, for a little bit, it was like the, I'm gonna go to hell thing. But then after a while, I started to kind of think to myself, well, that just doesn't seem right. Like, why should I? What wrong am I doing? And then that was kind of reaffirmed when I started like reading, and it wasn't necessarily something that I had a committed relationship to reading, but like different works by folks that kind of like reinterpret some passages, and specifically it's Sodom and Gomorrah. That was one of the passages. It's kind of just like that hearing, like I think it was specifically Soulfire's interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah. Reading that and reading how they kind of re-explain everything, I'm just like, that makes so much more sense. Because it wasn't necessarily that anything dealing with like being queer at all. It was more so in that you mistreated people that you were supposed to welcome, and that you offered violence to people instead of just treating people as good human beings. And it wasn't necessarily that they were doing anything, I don't think necessarily, and I may be kind of misremembering a little bit more of their interpretation, but that wasn't the decadence part. It was more so kind of like on your basis, actions and beliefs, that you were just outright denying people like their fellow humanity. And so you were just being closed off to yourself. And that's why Sodom and Gomorrah fell. It wasn't necessarily because people were just out here having gay sex all the time.
Which scripture is true? Who decides? Keep God first and thy neighbor as thyself. But how can people love one neighbor and hate another?
What I would have liked for my family to say to me when I was younger is that, they may not understand, but they still love people. I don't think that I necessarily got that all the way. I think in terms of parents, it's still always been a little bit divided in terms of like me understanding their perspective when it comes to the community. I'm thinking about just queer and trans people just together, like what their perspective is. Because my father, I remember even when I was like 7 or 8, I remember I was watching TV and there was a pride parade going on. And then he was walking by my room and then he shouted some slurs at them, and just like, it was just very negative, hateful reaction. But then when I was a little bit older, when I was about 12, 13 or so, there is this moment with my mom specifically, in that, and I kind of laugh on it now, but so one of my uncles is in a home, and so we basically always go and visit him for his birthday. And I remember he stepped out, and it was just me and her. I was just watching TV, and then she kind of like turns to me, and she's trying to muster up the courage to ask, but she's like, do you want to be the girlfriend in the relationship? And that's what she just kind of says to me, just trying to like, as I translate it now, to like, are you gay? That's like what she was trying to say, and how I translate that out now. And at that moment, I was like, no, what could you ever mean? Like, no, who I am now. And I recognize that now as like her attempt, and that she tried on some level. She wasn't out, she wasn't rejecting. It was kind of like, that was kind of like the message she was trying to send a little bit. And it wasn't very explicit, but it was like somewhat of the way there. And it's just more so kind of like, well, I want to know who my child is. And I think out of that place comes a little bit of acceptance and a little bit of, I want to work with you. I don't understand, but I love you. And that's what I would love to have had a little bit more of. And especially when I was younger, and to really just get a little bit more of that kind of like, assurance. Based on what I would tell families of Black, queer, and trans people, it would be more so kind of to help, to really be trying to be proactive and trying to understand where our perspectives come from. Because even in some families where, they are understanding, or they might feel they're understanding, to a young person, to someone that's in the family, it may not always seem that way. And there will always be that kind of, can I trust them? Because when people come out, people will come out, and anything could happen. You could think like your parents are gonna be okay with it, and then it's just like complete rejection. So it's really kind of like, for a family, you have to be very proactive in showing that you're trying to learn and trying to understand, and that you're accepting.
Maxine knows she is loved unconditionally by the higher power. From this relationship comes peace, strength, and wisdom to share.
And so I think for the family, like the rest of the family, as opposed to like the young person, like you have to really work and do some internal working and and that goes from speech, that goes from like, what you like to do, and like what you try to teach a younger person to do. It incorporates almost everything in our daily lives. So I think doing that internal work and being very upfront and being very like aware, and but also not trying to be the 110% ally in the work, and that, I do this, this, and this, and this, this, and this, but still being a little bit humble and just trying to just be on a proactive side.
Faith without works is dead. Maxine continues to have faith in God, herself, and possible change.
Well, I think what society, and as well as like the Black church, could do to better support Black, queer, and trans people would be primarily trying to make sure that we don't have as much stigma put upon us. Because I mean, even I'm thinking about if the world was so much more accepting than it is now, that people would still probably be a little bit, afraid to say exactly. Because again, you never really know what people are gonna say. And I would think that would go on for a while, and that, people also trying to come to terms with that, and that, the language that they use for themselves would be wrong. So I would say reduction of stigma. I would also say, with that stigma, that there is loss of access and opportunities, and creating more specific opportunities for us folks specifically. For the Black church specifically, it'll be more so kind of, again, being proactive and not necessarily trying to, kind of keep the same norms. It will be trying to change norms, and how people act and how people think and how people interact with us. Because if we can't come in, even if folks like me want to come in church, but we can't come in church because you have this very specific rigid way, then that's not accepting for me. That's not welcoming for me. I think what the Black Lives Matter movement has done has been able to, is kind of breathed in more life into like the fight for civil rights, and more so kind of not put specific people at the head. It's kind of reimagined, what communities fighting for their rights looks like. And it's kind of put it in a different perspective because even the founders, they're still the founders, but there's not one specific head. It's a movement across the country. It's all across parts of the world even. And so I think from that, then you get to these very specific community level conversations on what intersectionality looks like for us and what do we need. And I think it's opened up the opportunity for that. And I think, although I do think that, and I feel like it's a very interesting way to kind of like try to bring a little bit more nuance into like an analysis of it maybe, but there's also still the kind of like celebrity culture that goes with it. In that with BLM now, it also has become so much more of a common thing to say. And then it really matters also who's saying it and who's not saying it. And then also to what context they're saying it in. And so then at some points, it kind of gets co-opted.
Who matters and why? So many thoughts and concerns linger.
I feel for some people that because it is still a community level thing, it comes to you as how you see it. And I think where the conversations are, and I think are continuing to go, is in, well, so for you as an individual, this can mean this very narrow thing. But what we as an organization are trying to do is very expansive. And that when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we mean all kinds of Black folks. Now we've come to the point in the conversation that's reached the kind of like national level of BLM, and they're like all Black Lives Matter. And that when we're talking about Black people and Black people's lives being worth living and mattering, that you're thinking about Black queer people, Black trans people, Black sex workers, you're thinking about all kinds of Black people. And so we have this kind of understanding, because there's been so much work done on community levels to really try to address intersectionality with the movement, that the phrase that he would normally have used has been changed on its head. And it's been so amazing to see that. And it's been so great to see that work has been done, and that people are really more so kind of like engaging with it. And really trying to think about, what does our community look like? What can our community look like? What does it mean to, live a full and free life as a Black person? I think that these are questions that we have asked generationally before, but I think that with how the movement is now, that these are questions that are being asked so often that it's scary to some people. Because then it says to like, well, if you aren't already doing that, then we'd have to change something. And I think that change is something that is so frightening and so disorienting for people, and that they don't want to give up what they have. And they don't want to really accept that things need to change, and that what you're doing was problematic, and that what you're doing was more so kind of like, the word I'm thinking about is a danger to society, but I think a better word might be more so kind of, detrimental to society and to progress as a society. You have to stick with what works for you and what is best for you, and trying to envision a future for yourself. I think that one of the hardest things, even for me, especially even as an undergraduate, was for me to be able to conceive of, what is really possible for me. Because, there's so many people that just don't make it. There's so many people like me that just die. The average age for us specifically as Black trans women is supposed to be about 35. And so at that point, if this is who I am, then am I really just accepting that I'm live a horrible life, and I'm probably gonna die really young. And so just being able to imagine that, you can do something that is meaningful to you, I think, and keeping to that, I think, is the most important thing. Well, I think it goes back into like the stigma. And I think from that stigma, I mean, even just recently there was the incident with 3 trans women that are influencers that were beaten in not broad daylight, but out in public. It was in Hollywood. Police were even supposed to be in the area that they passed by and saw it, and no one did anything. And because of that stigma, violence is accepted for us, especially for Black trans women. Black trans women, like, our average age is like 35. And I think that also goes into just communities. When there's so much stigma placed on us, then there's so much acceptance of us being othered and being kicked out. I think in that there is kind of this really acceptance of, Black trans women not being poured into, not being worth being poured into by different organizations. People don't think specifically about this population. And I think people and organizations kind of leave Black trans women specifically, I think Black trans people as a whole, but trans women specifically, out to the side. Because they have this specific image in their head, they go ahead and try to attribute the violence to that person when they're in the physical world with that person. Just going in and compounding all that stigma and all this negativity that they have, because then what it means to be able to like put this violence on this person, it kind of says that like you have this power to be able to do so and not have anything be done to you.
Maxine's faith is tempered by wisdom. She loves, but is exposed to hate. Yet she continues to love and plan for the future.
I feel content with where I'm at. I feel content with where I think I'm going. I feel content with the vision I see for myself. I feel content with how things are going. And I understand that change will probably be bumpy and will come, which is what I'm hoping for. But I feel content in that I've given myself enough time and enough steps and enough maneuvers to be able to move through it.
Voices should be heard. They must be heard. Not only must Maxine's voice be heard, everything depends on it.